Today, we're going to be going around and painting up a video that is part of a multi-stage project. And some of the previous videos we've released are actually part of that project as well, and yet we haven't advertised that. Today, what we're going to be doing is painting up a T'au Broadside, and we're going to be painting it in a nice blue and grey scheme. No airbrush here, we're just going to be using brush, and let's jump into it. This model essentially has a few main elements. It's got some armour panels, of which we're going to be painting blue and black. It's also got some various accents, which we're going to be doing in red. So that's things like the missiles and the armaments, as well as we've got the structure and suit mechanical parts, which we're going to be doing in some varying metal tones. We are going to be kicking this model off with all of the base coating. We're going to be targeting the various areas and the ones that we can hit with contrast. Starting off, we can take a black contrast and hit all of the areas that are going to sit below the panels. As we're going to be using a dark colour for this, we naturally don't want to risk damaging any of the brighter, whiter colours, so we want to be careful when applying it. Naturally, this does mean that once we've gone round and covered all of the structural elements in this contrast, we can move across to the panels. Starting with a blue contrast, because blue is going to be the primary armour colour for this model, we can work around slowly covering all of the needed areas in the contrast. We want to avoid this being too heavy, as we are going to come back and apply multiple layers a bit later on. So we want this to be just enough to cover the area fully, without any mass pooling in the recesses or on top of the surfaces. We naturally want to avoid any of the panels or sections that we are going to be opting for a secondary colour, which in this case will be a grey tone. We need a blue to black contrast for this slightly lighter and cooler area than compared to the structure, which we used a pure black for. Following the same method, we need to work around slowly, not applying too much, aiming for a nice, clean, consistent layer. That nicely maps out all of the areas of colour across the model. Naturally, any of the elements that we haven't painted with contrast are going to be our final accent colour, which in this case is red. So we can come back and deal with that later, the same as painting actual metallics for all the metal areas. We can handle that a bit later on. For now, what we can do is start to come in and paint the armour panels, which is obviously going to mean targeting the blues or the grey areas. And we're going to be starting off with the blues because that's what we want to be the most brightest and punchiest on that area. And then that allows us to bring the blacks up appropriately once we finish the blues. We are going to be highlighting this model over the course of around 8 steps, which, don't worry, may sound overwhelming, but is in reality just a case of adding a small amount of a brighter colour to our contrast each time. We can start off by mixing a little bit of a bright blue into our dark blue contrast. This will give us a slightly lighter tone, which we can then use to bring up the overall brightness across the armour. We are essentially wanting to cover all of the armour that we want blue in this colour, which will act as our new base coat containing both our bright and dark blue tones. From there, we can progress up the highlights with adding a little bit more light blue to our last mix. We can then trace out the overall areas of highlight. This is an area where there are a lot of options in how we highlight. We can highlight in the sense of real life imitation or a stylized and distinct application. It's entirely your choice. Here we are aiming for a rippled highlight across the model, represented by thin bands of light across the surface going in certain and set directions, while giving the upward facing sections a nice larger, flatter highlight. With our sections all entirely now mapped out, we can add a little bit more of our brighter blue to the mix, and then come in and start to repeat the last stage. But this time we are aiming to apply a slightly narrower and smoother highlight pass, bringing up the overall brightness on those areas and giving us some nice brightness contrast across the panels. It's worth noting that when we're going through and documenting the various mixes that we're using, to apply those, we are doing multiple glazes at each stage. And the reason for that is it allows us to gradually build up the purity of colour before we add in a brighter mixed tone. When we're glazing, it's important to have control on the application. So we need to have a thinned mix so that we put down a thinner controlled amount of pigment. But more importantly, we need to control the amount of glaze or paint within our brush so that we can control it when applying it on thinner, more tight areas, as well as larger panels. Now, all of our highlight colors are essentially being made out of a mix, and that mix contains our contrast. And the contrast helps thin it down, giving us a good consistency, but it's not enough. We are going to have to add water to it, as well as we're adding paint, because naturally it's thicker than water and contrast, we're going to have to add about the same amount of water to our mix to ensure that we keep the right consistency. With a little bit of work done on the highlights, we can now switch to reinforcing the shadows. This is easily done by taking our pure contrast and diluting it with both water and contrast medium until we have a thin blue tint. This can then be applied over all of the areas where the highlights start pulling towards the shadows. What we want to do is apply at the point of transition and drag down towards the shadowed and darker areas. This will not only darken the shadowed areas with each application, but it will also smooth out the highlight blend slightly. With the transition smoothed, we can then jump back to quickly highlighting, and we'll do this by taking our pure thin blue, thinning it down until we have a nice glaze consistency, and then start to apply the shape highlights and edge highlights over all of the edges and panels, making sure to target the center of any broad light streaks. The next two steps are actually a rinse and repeat. Taking a thin contrast glaze of our base coat, we can drag from the areas of highlight back down towards the shadows and recesses, applying multiple thin coats until we have a really nice transition to our bright blue from our dark base. This bright blue can then be used to finish off with a final round of highlights, picking out the main shape and edges of all of the highlights that we've applied through multiple thin passes. It is possible to leave it here, but I personally think this is a little bit bright, so we are going to darken down the panels a little bit by applying a thin glaze of our blue contrast. But this time, rather than just picking out our shadow areas and transitions, we can apply it thinly across the entire surface of all of our panels, helping to blend our final bright highlight blue. That essentially finishes off those stages. We could come back if we want with a thinned down blue highlight and go around and do a very precise edge or spot highlight in certain areas. But for today, we're leaving it here. And that finishes off the armor. Well, at least it finishes off the blue sections of armor, because now what we're going to do is come in and paint the black sections of armor, which we've done with, so far, a dark black blue contrast. And we're going to be doing a very similar technique, following similar sort of methods, but with a little bit of variation on this particular pass. Naturally, we've already gone around and base coated all of the panels on the model. So we've either got the blue that we've done or we've got the black. And so we need to pick a highlight color to start mixing into our base coat in order to get a progressive highlight. And in order to try and maintain a little bit of color consistency, we're going to actually be using the same blue for the highlight of the blacks that we did use for the highlight of the blues. Let's jump into that now. We want to take our bright blue we used earlier and slowly mix this into our black contrast we used for a base, thinning it with a little bit of water to the right consistency before we re-base coat all of the dark surfaces, giving us a nice dark mid-tone to work from. We want to naturally pick out all of the panels and sections that we want in this color before we start to add a little of our highlight color to the previous mix, naturally diluting with a little bit of water as we go. We can start to then map out all of the highlight paths, similar to before, catching all of the edges on any of the panels while making sure to also follow through any of the highlights that are on sections of the blue armor that would naturally fall across onto sections of the black armor. With another addition of a little bit of blue to our mix, we can start to build up a lot of variation in tone. As I mentioned, we are following essentially the same theory as we did for the blue armor, meaning we will be applying a layer of a smoother and thinner application as we progress up through the highlights. We are going to do this one more time, adding a little bit more blue until this tone reminds me of a sort of dark blue metal tone while being non-metallic. This highlight will be on the narrow application, essentially replicating an edge highlight for this model, As that would imply, we want to then use this on all of the edges of the panels, as well as the center of any bright light paths. Now, you might feel that this is a little bit bright, but you've hopefully also noticed a couple of other things. One, you might not be subscribed. Two, we've only been going in and glazing up highlight colors. And three, by the nature of number two, we haven't been going round and glazing in some shadows. So we're going to be fixing that third one now by taking our dark contrast base, thinning it down and coming in and doing some shade glazing. For this shading glaze, we are going to first need to thin down our base coat with a decent portion of contrast medium, giving us a nice dark tint. This first layer can then be applied as an application across all of the panels. This will evenly darken everything and stop there being too much brightness battling against the blue on the model. But also, once the first coat is dry, we can come in and apply some more precise glazing, pulling down towards the shadows as we did on the blue armor earlier, giving us a nice darker shadow and nice smooth transition blends. With the blue and the black done, that essentially sorts out the largest chunk of the model, but what we do have is the various metal structure elements. And obviously all of the highlights that we've done across the blacks and the blues have been driving towards that colder, cooler tone. So to add in a little bit of variation now, what we're going to do is try and drive the metals towards the warmer color tone so that we've got some cool and warm tones together. Regardless of the chosen end finish, we are going to be starting from essentially the same place, which is a nice clean base coat of a dark to medium bronze. We do need to be careful while we work around and paint any of these areas, ideally using a smaller brush, being careful to avoid any of the areas that we've already painted because we don't want metallic flakes on our nice blue armor. Any truly hard to reach areas can be left in the black base coat, but overall we are aiming to catch the entire frame and any of the areas of structure that we want in our metal colors. From there, we can start to split out and start highlighting in different directions. This involves taking a highlight color. We are using a silvery gold here in order to pick out various elements, trying to keep the ratios and areas consistent on each side of the model. For the silver, we are hitting the elements such as bolts, panels, and some of the various attachments bolted onto the suit. We can conveniently measure the ratios here because anywhere that we're not painting in this new color will be the one that gets a nice coat of gold. The coat of gold is going to come in a richer form, more vibrant colored gold. This new gold can be used as a highlight on all of the remaining metal areas that we haven't hit with the previously used silvery gold tone. This includes all of the main structures and weight-bearing elements of the battlesuit, giving us a nice variation, but also change from silver to gold. This can be a little bit harsh sometimes, and there might not be that much depth. So what we're going to do is finish it off by doing a nice final application of a contrast. But we are going to be thinning this contrast down using a fair amount of medium and water until we have essentially a brown tint glaze, which we can then use to apply over all of the various metal elements, which will nicely complement and warm up the metals, as well as giving us some nice recess shading and separation on those areas. This essentially leaves us with one main area, which is all of the accent areas, which we've so far unpainted entirely. And we're going to be using that in the form of a red, painting it rather than using a contrast, which is one of the reasons that we left it to the end rather than painting it with all the other contrast elements. It's also worth pointing out that we're targeting the things like the rockets, the panels, as well as things like the lenses. And the lenses are done slightly differently, but they're both starting off from the same place, which is a nice burgundy red. This is the only areas on the model that we're not painting with a contrast. Instead, we need to carefully apply a couple of thin coats of a burgundy until we end up with a nice, clean, consistent dark red base to build on. For all of the panels and rockets, what we want to do is take a pure bright red, thin this down, and then over the course of multiple thin layers, glaze up over the brighter areas, building up multiple passes of the thin red, each one slowly bringing up the brightness as we narrow the coverage area. Whereas for the elements like the lights and the lenses, we need to go from our burgundy base straight into a thin application of a white, aiming to build a medium-sized dot in the center of any lights and lenses, leaving the dark red around the edges. From there, we can take a gloss glaze, like the Spirit Stone effect paint from Citadel, which we are using here. We can apply a coat of this over the lenses and lights. This will show and shine a little bit more where the red elements weren't and where we painted the white dot. Therefore, we can let it dry and come in and apply another pop of white, this time aiming for it to be smaller in the sense of a dot or a line to represent the heat and heart of the light or lens. Naturally, this will then need to be covered up as it's currently white, so we need to go back to the red gloss that we were using once it's dry and then give the whole lens another nice coat of this, which will give us that nice glow depth to the lens and lights. Then it is just a case of reassembly. Obviously, if you didn't build or paint the model in sub-assemblies, then you don't need to reassemble it. But personally, I think that this actually does well with sub-assemblies. There's a lot of bulky parts. It makes it easier to maneuver around by having it in sub-assemblies, as well as going in and adjusting it and being able to maneuver and paint certain areas a lot easier, and then just assembling at the end. But I appreciate that, as you've probably seen, if you watch other content on my channel, I do enjoy sub-assemblies. I use it quite a lot, and I prefer having the access, and I don't mind having my model split into a couple of different parts for me to assemble halfway through or at the end of the project. But overall, I like how this came out. Let me know what you think. This is the end result. Obviously, this is going in a wider project, let's say. So I don't really want to be putting it on a base. So currently we're just going to be blue tacking it to a base so that it doesn't get damaged. Here we are then as a finished final outcome. Obviously, this is what we are currently left with. The model is on a base currently, but will be in a wider project later. Overall, I like this model. I think, though, that the black came out really, really nice. I have used a similar recipe for this sort of style black before, but I think this one is improved and slightly better. And if we spend a little bit more time on it and potentially push the contrast between the dark and the bright, it would be a really good option for some non-metallic metal. As I mentioned earlier, this model is part of a wider project, but I've also released some videos already which are connected to this project without stating that they are part of a wider project. So if you want to go around and try and find out what videos they are, and you have yourself a suspicion, drop a comment down below with what you think the final project may be and what videos you think are connected to it, and we can see what goes on. This is something that I'm hoping to do and get done by the end of this month or so you won't have to wait too long to see the final outcome. If you want to start the hunt for potentially related content, then why not check out this video here? I can't guarantee that it's got anything to do with the project, but it's a good place to start. Otherwise, if you don't have time now, do remember to subscribe so that we can see you next time.